Hey guys, in this video I thought that I could give you some ideas on how to use brushstrokes in your paintings, and there are many ways to use brushstrokes, and all of the tips that I'm about to say in this video, you don't have to use all of them in every single painting, but just when you're feeling lost, maybe you can go through this checklist of like different ideas and see that if these tips are something that you can utilize to fix your painting when it feels like there's some kind of like disorganized mess happening. And I think most of the anxiety when it comes to painting is like just when you don't know what to fix. So these checklists are the best way to get out of those situations. And when I was doing research for this video, I looked at many other videos and articles on this topic, and when I typed into Google, I would always get these like insta-fill questions that like how to blend brushstrokes, or how to make your brushstrokes disappear, or how to hide your brushstrokes. And me, coming from an oil painting background, I'm sitting there just like, why? I mean, think about your painting as a story, and your brushstrokes are your handwriting, and they can emphasize the way that the story is told. So it's not just about what you're saying, you should also pay attention to how you're saying it. And in that sense, I see no reason why you should blend away or hide your brushstrokes, because they are the most unique part about how you paint. Like nobody else can replicate that like handwriting look that you do when you do paintings. So I definitely don't recommend doing that. I mean, imagine that if these articles that I was like Googling work and everybody follows them, then the painting style of everybody will eventually look exactly the same. And is that what you want? I wouldn't say that that's a great idea if you want to like stand out or brand yourself and your own look in the world. And when going through like artist portfolios, those are the ones that you immediately throw away, because if they look like everybody else, why would you hire them? Like they don't have any point of view to say. This is just my opinion, but anyway, I love brushstrokes. I think there's nothing wrong with like your brushstrokes showing in the picture, but just having a clear goal of what you want to say with those brushstrokes. That can like emphasize or distract. And I know it's a hard skill, but it's a skill and all skills are learnable, so that's why we're here. So when it comes to oil painting, there are two types of brushes really. I know there are all kinds of crazy shapes, but like these are the main shapes. The flat end brush that has hard edges on the sides, and this that like initially might look similar, but it has this like rounded edge. So you can get like a wide brush stroke with this, and the tip is always kind of like soft. And most of my brushes are in one of those two categories. It just depends on like what I want to use, but usually when I do paintings, and I've said this many times, I only use one brush for the whole painting. So where I get those hard and soft edges is with opacity and the way that I like apply the brush stroke. If I press hard, the tip will look hard, but if I just like softly like ease into the brush stroke, that will create this like soft edge to the entire brush stroke. So that will like replicate this look. So for me, getting those two looks from the same brush, like it makes painting process go much faster. So when it comes to designing your brush strokes in your painting, there are these categories that you can consider: contrast, contrasting lines, pattern, softness, perspective, size, active, non-active surfaces, direction, movement, boldness, and then the final part, which is hard to explain, but I'm going to try to explain it anyway at the end of this video, and that is ringing color. Let's start with contrast. Like when you have two types of brush strokes in your painting, for example soft edges and hard edges, the attention of your viewer will be drawn to those hard edges in the painting. So for example, let's say that you have a background of a sky and they have like soft clouds there. The clouds will like recede into the background because they don't have as hard edges. So when you want to have hard edges in your painting, it's best to reserve those to the areas where you want to describe the shape. or draw the attention of the eye to that specific point. Think about in photography and when you have this kind of blurred background look. Like it immediately draws the attention to the point where the sharpness is at its maximum. So if you have a lot of background elements that are like detailed and have a lot of brush strokes, the eye will be drawn to there, and if that's your focal point, that's fine. But if it's not, then you're just drawing the attention of the eye to a point where you don't want the viewer to be paying attention to. So think about where you want the person to be looking at, and that can help you design your brushstrokes. Then contrasting lines. So this painting here, I have contrasting lines pretty much everywhere. So the whole painting is based on this kind of like line rhythm of different brushstrokes. So I have a lot of like squiggly lines going that way, and then they are immediately met with other brushstrokes that are coming this way. And there's no like specific focal point. Like with this kind of line rhythm, I just want the eye to move around the painting everywhere, and I'm trying to direct the eye with these like diagonal lines and curved lines so that you are not going out of the painting, that whenever you are meeting the edge of the screen, like let's say that like the edge of the screen is here, then there is always something that will kind of like direct you back into the painting. So those are contrasting lines. The contrasting lines can kind of like focus attention to the point where the two different angled lines meet, or they can like help move the eye across the painting. Then there's pattern. I explained how I use pattern in this illustration, and here you can see that there are groups of patterns. There are horizontal lines, there are round lines, and then there are this kind of like very non-contrasty lines in the background. The contrasting lines are grouped into different sets so that it's easier for the viewer to understand what that painting is about. I'm gonna give a link in the cards to this video where you can also see this grouping in action. And the grouping with different types of patterns, like that's a very powerful composition technique. And you don't have to have like different objects that form the composition. That can be also the brushstrokes and the way that you design those. So size. The bigger your brushstrokes are, the less lines you are going to have in that area. So if you have, for example, a background, it's usually, not always, but usually it's a good idea to take out a much bigger brush and have less brushstrokes in the areas that you don't want the attention to go towards. And when you have details, use those smaller brushes there. But if you have the same brush everywhere, there's not that contrast in size. This is a very bad example that I'm doing in this video, because there's basically no size variation to brush strokes. I know this as a fact, that I just like doing small squiggly brush strokes when it comes to like huge plain areas like the sky, and it's just relaxing for me, and that's not like a composition tip, it's just something that I like to do. So I'm trying to differentiate this video's information from the stuff that I actually like to do, and that's just part of my style. With the number of brush strokes that are kind of like dictated by the size of your brush strokes, there are these active and non-active areas. Active areas are when you have a lot of, like for example, those contrasting lines or small different brush strokes in one area. Non-active areas are where you have low contrast and huge brush strokes, so you don't have a lot of stuff in that area for the eye to look at. So when you design those active and non-active areas, like that's also a good idea to think about the brush strokes that you are using there. For example, if you have a huge empty space and it looks like the composition is not just kind of like holding that empty space together, you can take out smaller brush strokes and just make that area more interesting. Even if it's just like a big blue sky or a big patch of grass, when you paint it in an interesting way and when it has like a color variation and just very tiny low contrast interest going on there, you can like hold up big empty spaces. If you look at a lot of Monet paintings, the skies are like super interesting to look at, even though there's nothing there. There's no dramatic clouds or anything. It's just brush strokes. and that holds up the piece. Then the direction. If you think about the direction of brushstrokes, when you look at the background here, you can see that these long lines are always directing the attention towards where that line is going. So there is like this line of direction and this line of direction, and they are creating this sort of like spiral rhythm around my head. Direction is important because you never want to lead the eye out of the painting. And this is something that is easy to check if you just flip the canvas horizontally, and then it's usually very apparent like where you are kind of like leading the eye out of the picture. Because if you are directing the eye out of the picture, you can use the same looping lines to bring the attention back in. Long lines can also emphasize speed and movement in your painting. So if you have long sweeping lines, it looks like motion blur basically. So you can use that as an effective trick. Also, when you're depicting movement in a painting, if it's a very dynamic image, I recommend using bigger brushes and long sweeping strokes, because if you have those tiny details everywhere and you are, for example, trying to paint somebody running, it will look very stiff because there is too much detail and you don't pay attention to that much detail when you see a person running past you. It's just the main gist of the idea that you need to get across, and there you can just use more like quick gestural movements. Then is the hard to explain parts, and these are very important, so I decided to not leave them out just because they're hard to explain, but I'm going to try anyway. Then there is boldness, and boldness is how much you are saying of the story with your brushstrokes. Sometimes this is a good idea, sometimes the brushstrokes can get in the way, but if you can master the timing of when the brushstrokes matter, that can generate your own unique style of painting, because these decisions are unique to how you choose to make them, and there are millions of like brushstroke decisions in a single painting, so it's impossible for anybody else to replicate, and that's why it's so effective to make your own style with the way you paint. And that's why I always say that like don't hide away from brushstrokes, just maybe think about how you use them, and then they won't be a problem, they will be an asset. And with boldness comes also the opacity of the brushstrokes. I almost always use 100% opacity, like sometimes I dip to about 70% depending on the brush, they react to opacity differently, but I try to have like full opaque brushstrokes, and when I want to have those like soft edges, then I just use pressure to do those lighter brushes. There's this video about like how I make my own brushes and what features I want to have in a brush, and it's mostly about how I make a brush that I can use for the whole painting, so that I don't have to go into that brush menu and flip through hundreds of brushes. I definitely don't recommend any of you to become a brush hoarder, and just focus on how you use the brush, and you can do all the things that are in that brush menu with a single brush when you have one that works for most occasions. I mean, when I paint with oils, these are my options, and I have to say that I mostly use these. Like you can see that the other one is like much more dirtier, and this is basically brand new. Then the hard part, which is ringing color. I remember like yesterday when my teacher told me how a color of brushstrokes rings with each other, and she showed me one point in my painting where I have like two brushstrokes that are really close to each other in value. They just had a different hue and they were next to each other, and from far away, if you squint, you don't even see them. But when they are next to each other, those two brushstrokes in the same area, they kind of start to ring. And it took me a really long time to understand what she meant by this. It's that the eye starts to move between the two different colors, and you are optically blending that color in your head, and that creates what I call these like high calorie surfaces of color surfaces. Like for example, the opposite of what I like to call a high calorie color surface is a paint bucket. if you just fill in one area with one color, if you, for example, just fill in the sky with a paint bucket of blue, there's nothing for the eye to hang on to. Like, it doesn't give me whatever visual nutrients. But when you have those like different hue variations and different brushstrokes just going all around the area that could just be a blank blue sky, suddenly it transforms that area into something much more, and it's much more interesting to look at. And especially when you have a print like that on your wall in a large scale, when it has those different hue variations and the color is ringing, it's just so pleasant to look at. And I will never get tired of like finding those right hues that are next to each other, and when it starts to ring and when it makes your eye travel between those two brushstrokes, and it just makes you make the picture. I mean, the painting is kind of like just a cue for the viewer to see the image, and when the viewer sees the image in their own head in a much more complete way than it is presented to them, that makes that experience personal, and that makes the viewer to be part of that experience. It sounds like I'm trying to explain black magic, but I'm sure that this is a topic that we'll return to many times. I don't know if I'm doing a good job of explaining this, but I'm trying, and it's really hard concept to grasp. I can just show a few areas where the brushstrokes are close to each other and the color starts to ring here in these examples. So basically it's two different colors that are close to each other in value, and when they're next to each other, that makes that area to have more like vibrancy. And it's not just saturation, it's somehow more. Those are my main tips for using brushstrokes in your painting, and if you want to look at those other videos, I will link them in the description below. Go out there and don't hide your brushstrokes. Like, really, don't waste time doing that stuff. You could use that time to improve your own painting skills instead. Okay. Have fun, guys. Bye.